It's so good to be able to be here. Thanks heaps, Jack. That's great. It's so good to be able to be here, and I'm really excited for what God's going to be doing this morning, or continue to be doing this morning. We are in the middle of we've just started, DJ just kicked off last week, a new series called The Good Life According to Jesus. In this series, we're going to be making our way through Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. I'm so excited for what this series is going to hold. I think Jesus is just awesome. And the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount are beautiful and challenging and surprising and confusing all at the same time sometimes. So I'm really excited for this series, and we're calling it The Good Life According to Jesus, partly because when Jesus begins his Sermon on the Mount, he begins it by speaking about the good life. In fact, the very first word in the sermon could be translated as the good life, or the good life belongs to ... And we're going to get to that in a little bit later on. But for now, what's interesting is the kinds of people that Jesus says have the good life are the poor and the mourning and the persecuted. The good life, according to Jesus, belongs to those who feel like they're at the end of their rope. And so that's what we're going to explore this morning. This morning, I'd like to explore how the good life belongs to those we might not expect. And in a few minutes, we're going to be reading our passage for this morning. So just to give you a heads up, it's in Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to start in verse 1. So if you've got your Bibles or Bible apps, I encourage you to open them up there, Matthew chapter 5, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But first, I just want to set the scene, because I think it's really important as we read these words of Jesus to have in our heads, who is it that is originally listening to Jesus? Who's in the crowds? Who is Jesus speaking to? DJ looked at this a bit last week, and how at the end of chapter 4, we see Jesus speaking to a bunch of different people. We see a bunch of different people that Jesus is going to and seeking out. And these are... Importantly, these are crowds that are following Jesus, but they're not filled with people who have their lives together. We shouldn't think of people who can afford to spend hundreds of dollars to go see the latest preacher or something like this. No, we should think of people whose lives are messed up. People who are at the end of their rope, the sick, the diseased, the pained, those under spiritual and physical oppression. We should think of the least, the last, the lost, those on the edges of society. It's these people, as well as I'm sure their family and their friends, who are flocking to Jesus. And it's these people who are, many of them, choosing to become his disciples, choosing to become followers of Jesus. And what's amazing is that it is these kinds of people that Jesus chooses to highlight and celebrate at the beginning of this remarkable sermon. It's these kinds of people that Jesus uses to kind of set the tone for the sermon to come. And so just to help us get a bit of a sense of what I think Jesus is doing here, I'd like to show you a couple of images. You might be familiar with something like this, but this is from an art exhibition by Tim Noble and Sue Webster back in 2002. And in this exhibition, what you do is you walk into this room and you would see something like this. It's a pile of, what appears to be a pile of rubbish. You know, broken chairs and cans, toilet paper, just a bunch of garbage in seemingly no particular order. But then the lights go off and the spotlight comes on. And in the shadow, you see this image of people. In other words, it's with a shift of perspective, and when the light comes in, that we're actually able to see things differently. The things which once appeared to be discarded pieces of rubbish is transformed into something completely different. And I think this is a little bit of what Jesus is doing here at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. He's shining the light on these people. He's shining a light on people who may have appeared to be like discarded pieces of rubbish. And he's giving an entirely new perspective to them and to us who hear his words. So with that in mind, let's dive into our passage for this morning. I'd like to invite up Evan, who's going to read our passage, and then we'll get into it. Brilliant. Thanks heaps, Evan.
Okay, so we're reading Matthew 5, 1 to 12. I'm reading from the NIV. Now Jesus saw the crowd, and he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much, Evan. Okay, so there's a lot in here. Let's start with the word that gets repeated a whole bunch in this passage. It's the word blessed. And I don't know about you, but for me, this just feels like one of those really Christian words. You know, it's one of those words that we hear so often that it's easy to kind of forget or not even know what it means. What is this word referring to? Well, interestingly, there are two words in the Bible which are translated into English with the word blessed. Now, one of those words refers to kind of divine favor from God. So think about Genesis 1, when God creates humanity, he blesses them and he says, "Be fruitful and multiply." Or later on in Matthew, when Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey and they say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now, that's one of the words which is translated with the word blessed. But that word, meaning divine favor, is not used here. Instead, Jesus uses a different word, which is often translated as blessed. It's the Greek word makarios. It's always fun when you learn Greek on a Sunday morning. So now this word can be translated as blessed, but it also means happy or fortunate. You know, it's kind of like, how's life? Oh, so blessed. It's that kind of thing. Now, something that's really interesting is that something that was typical of rabbis and wisdom teachers in Jesus' day was to point to someone who they considered to be living the good life and to say, that person is makarios. That person is blessed. So, you know, if I was back in those days, I might look to someone who's hanging out with a bunch of friends, playing some good games, eating some good food, and be like, that person is Makarios. So Jesus wasn't the first rabbi to do this kind of thing that we read in Matthew chapter 5. In fact, Jesus wasn't the first Jesus to do this kind of thing that we read in Matthew chapter 5. There was a Jewish scribe writing in around the 2nd century BC, and his name was Jesus ben Sirah, Jesus son of Sirah. And he uses this word, Makarios, to describe the kinds of people that he considered to be living the good life. Now, you can see the passage on the screen. I'm not going to read it all out, but some of the people that he thinks are Makarios or blessed, think about this in contrast to what our Jesus was saying. He says, a man who can rejoice in his children. A man who lives to see the downfall of his foes, the one who has not served an inferior, the one who listens to attentive listeners. Okay, so that's who Jesus ben Sirah considers to be Makarios or blessed. That's the good life according to Jesus, son of Sirah. But what about Jesus, son of the Father? Well, notice the kinds of people that our Jesus is calling Makarios: the poor, the mourning, those being persecuted. It's not the kinds of people that you would expect to be living the good life. You wouldn't typically say, oh yeah, that's the good life, right? So what's going on here? What is Jesus doing here? Well, I think we need to remember who Jesus is talking to and what he's just been going around doing. So who he's been talking to is the sick, the crippled, the lame, the demon-possessed, those who are at the edges of society. And what he's been doing is he's been going around to them and announcing the good news that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is near, it's within reach. You can grab hold of it. And so it seems to me like Jesus considers these people to be Makarios or blessed because God's kingdom is good news for these kinds of people. It's good news for the very people that he's describing here. And so therefore, Makarios are these people. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the Beatitudes now. And I don't know whose idea it was to put this all in 1 week. It was my idea. But I've put myself in a bit of a tight spot here. So here's the plan. I've had to cut out a lot from my sermon. So if you have any questions, please come chat with me. I'd love to share. But for the sake of time, we're going to watch a video from our friends at Bible Project, and they're going to do an overview of the Beatitudes, and they're going to go through each one, but they're going to say it much quicker than I could, and probably in a more engaging way as well. But then we're going to come back, and I want to dig deeper into a few of these in particular. Okay, so let's watch this video.
2,000 years ago, on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea, a teacher named Jesus of Nazareth went up onto a hillside and addressed a large crowd.
It was a crowd of nobodies. Poor and sick people, their land occupied by the Roman Empire, who charged heavy taxes. This is a ragtag group.
And while they don't look like much, Jesus claimed that something surprising was starting with them.
So he opened his mouth and said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of the skies." The kingdom of the skies? What does that mean?
Well, Jesus uses this phrase to talk about a new kind of reality. From our perspective, we see a world of violence and corruption where might makes right. But for Jesus, there is a realm where generosity reigns, where there's justice and peace. It's a world where love is the final word.
And that reality might as well be up in the skies. It's beyond us.
Exactly. It's God's heavenly reality, which might seem far off. But Jesus was claiming that heaven was coming to earth, right here and now, beginning with these people.
That's unexpected.
And so is what he says next.
Blessed are those who grieve, for they will be comforted.
So this group that's at the bottom of society, they know all about loss and grief. But Jesus said something's coming that's going to turn sorrow into joy.
And then he said, "Blessed are the unimportant, for they will inherit the land."
And these people are not powerful or important, but just wait, Jesus says, because one day it will be you all who are ruling the world.
You know, it kind of sounds like Jesus is trying to start a revolution.
Well, kind of, but it's not a revolution for those who are hungry for power or influence. This is a movement of people who are going to serve because they long for healthy relationships between people and communities and nations.
Yeah, as Jesus puts it next, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy."
Just imagine it. A group of powerless nobodies ruling the world through generosity and forgiveness and justice. This is a Jesus-style revolution.
The next thing Jesus says is, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." And this one really raises the bar. To be part of this revolution, my heart needs to be so pure I could look directly at God.
Well, Jesus knows that all of our choices, even our good ones, are often driven by mixed motives. For Jesus, real peace is only possible through people who know that they need to be transformed if they're going to truly love God and others.
And this sounds wonderful, but it's a radical calling.
That's exactly right. In fact, Jesus goes on to explore just how radical it is.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God.
So God's new reality won't just happen by itself. It requires people who are willing to enter into the conflicts of others, urging and helping create a way towards peace.
But that way of life can be dangerous. And so Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of the skies."
Yeah, entering into conflicts and advocating for peace, that's not a comfortable way to live. And so Jesus calls people to this peacemaking revolution, and he names the high cost.
Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in the skies is great, for they persecuted the prophets who were before you in the same way. What does that mean, the prophets before you?
Well, Jesus and this whole crowd are Israelites. And in their Hebrew scriptures, God promised that it would be through Israel that his kingdom would be restored over all the world.
But as the story goes, Israel becomes as corrupt and violent as everyone else, and they end up enslaved to oppressive nations.
But Israel's prophets stood up to these kingdoms and criticized their corruption. They said that one day God's heavenly kingdom would break in, starting with a small group of Israelites who would be willing to surrender everything over to God.
So Jesus wants this crowd to see that they're part of that legacy.
Yes, and that's why Jesus concludes this first block of teaching with 3 images from their scriptures.
The first is, "You are the salt of the land."
Salt is a mineral that preserves food for a long time. And in the Bible, salt is used as a symbol of God's long-lasting covenant with Israel. Jesus is saying that he and this ragtag group are the launch party of God's long-lasting ancient promises to renew the world.
And then Jesus says, "You are the light of the world, and a city on a hill cannot be hidden."
He's referring to the biblical image of God's light, his presence shining out from its dwelling place in the temple in Jerusalem, which was a city on a hill.
But these people, they aren't the rulers. I mean, they don't even live in Jerusalem.
And yet, surprise, Jesus says, you all are God's salt and city and light. You all are the blessed ones, the new Jerusalem that's going to display God's kingdom to all the world.
Okay. So that was a bit of an overview as well as a sneak peek into next week when we have a look at salt and light. But what I want to do now is I want to go back to the start of Jesus' sermon and have a closer look at just a few of the things that he's saying. He begins by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." So the Greek word for poor here, believe it or not, it means poor. I know that might seem a bit obvious, but whatever we make of the phrase in spirit, Jesus is talking about the poor here. He's talking about those who are barely getting by. He's talking about those who are dependent on others. In fact, in Luke's account of this sermon, Jesus simply says, "Blessed are the poor." But here he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." So what might this mean? What does in spirit mean here? Well, this phrase actually appears a bunch in the Bible. It means, so to be something in spirit was a way of speaking about someone's way of being, someone's state of being. It's a way of speaking about their inner world. So think about some of these examples. Those who are crushed in spirit, or those who are lowly in spirit, or those who are humble and contrite in spirit. All of these examples are speaking about people's inner worlds, their way of being, their state of being in life. And so we do a similar thing in English when we talk about someone being in high spirits or someone being in low spirits or broken in spirit. So what does it mean to be poor in spirit? Well, these are those who are not only poor, but they feel it in their very being. They not only do they not have the physical resources, but they don't even have their inner resources to get themselves out of the situation they're in. You could say these are the powerless in all senses of the word. One commentary puts it that they are poor in fact and poor in spirit. But I think there's even more that's implied here, because we've got the whole Bible as kind of the background, and throughout the Old Testament, and especially in Matthew's gospel, the poor are those who very often are looking to God as the only one who can rescue and protect them. So the poor are those who've been brought to a place where they know that they need God. They can't do things in their own strength, in their own ability. We can sometimes lull ourselves into a false sense of security and think that we can solve our own problems. But these are those who know that they need God to act on their behalf. And so the good news is that the kingdom of heaven, which has drawn near, it's at hand, belongs to these kinds of people. All right, moving down a couple of verses now, Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." I don't know about you, but meek is not a word that I typically use in everyday speech. And in fact, if you look up the definition, a lot of dictionaries give the synonym of submissive. So is that who the meek are in this verse, those who are submissive? Well, the original word that's used here doesn't so much refer to those who are submissive, but rather those who have been brought into submission, those who have been brought down low. The Old Testament equivalent of this word refers to those who've been exploited, those who've had their land taken away from them. So we should think of people who, for one reason or another, have been taken advantage of, those who've had their land and possessions taken from them, and so as a result, they don't have much of a place in society. They don't have much of a voice in the community. And I think this is really important to know when we look at the second line in this verse, because the word that's translated earth here, it's just the standard Greek word for land. It makes much more sense, I think, that Jesus is speaking to the meek, the exploited, those brought into submission, and saying to them they will receive their land back. We see promises like this in the Old Testament law, where those who have had their land taken away from them, it will be returned to the original families and tribes. And it also means, and I think this is really important, because if something's taken away from you, it can be tempting to try and take it back by force. But this is inherited. It's given. It need not be taken back by force if we trust in Jesus' promise here. Something that you might have missed is that Jesus is actually quoting a psalm here. He's quoting Psalm 37. And this psalm is speaking about those who've been wronged, those who've been exploited, and it's encouraging them to hope and trust not in themselves, but in God. It says, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret, it only leads to evil. For those who are evil will be destroyed, but those who hope in the Lord will inherit the land. A little while, and the wicked will be no more. Though you will look for them, they will not be found. But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity." Okay, so that's the meek. Doing a bit of a speed run here. Jesus then says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." All right, righteousness. This is another one of those religious words, which it's like, what does that even mean? Here, this comes up a bunch in the Sermon on the Mount, so we'll have a few opportunities to wrap our heads around it. But really simply, for me, the idea that I like to keep in my head when I see this word is right making things right. And so this word, it sometimes refers to the things in me which need to be made right, but then other times it refers to the things in our world that need to be made right. We often call this justice. And then other times, in fact, very often, it's talking about our relationships, our relationship with God and our relationship with others, which need to be made right. So all of these ideas and so much more are wrapped up in this word righteousness. It's all about right making. But notice here that Jesus doesn't say, "Blessed are those who are righteous." He says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." You don't hunger and thirst for something that you have. In fact, if you're literally hungry and thirsty, it's probably been a good while since you had something to eat or drink. In other words, Jesus is speaking about people who've been experiencing the wrongs of this world, people who are longing for wrongs to be made right, people who've experienced the consequences of their own wrongdoing and the wrongdoing of others. We should think about people with messed up relationships, people who feel far from God, people who are hungry and thirsty for wrongs to be made right. And the promise of Jesus is that these people will have their fill. These people will have a feast of right making that is to come. And I think it's fitting that Jesus here talks about righteousness, about right making, because the way that I see it, this is the turning point in these blessings. Notice that in the first four blessings, or Makarios sayings, Jesus has been talking about those who've experienced the wrongs in this world. And then in the next four of these blessings or sayings, Jesus turns to speak about people who are making wrongs right in this world. He talks about the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers. And he kind of ends a section, because it's similar to the first one. I mean, to nerd out too much, but he ends the section by again speaking about righteousness. Those who are persecuted because of righteousness, because they're trying to make wrongs right in this world. In other words, in verse 10, those people are being wronged because they're trying to make wrongs right. And then there's a shift at the end in verses 11 and 12. Jesus, up to this point, has been speaking really generally. He's been speaking about those who mourn, or those who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, the poor, the meek, the merciful. He's been speaking really generally, but now in verse 11, he starts to speak directly. And he doesn't say, "Blessed are those," he says, "Blessed are you." In fact, Jesus is going to continue to speak directly throughout the whole rest of his sermon. And And so this last section is like a transition point for Jesus as he speaks to his disciples and encourages them to rejoice, even when things are not going the way that they should, even when we take on the wrongs of this world as we try to make wrongs right. Okay, I'd like to invite up the worship team now as I come to a close, because there's a lot of information in that I'm kind of putting across here. But what Jesus is doing here at the beginning of his Sermon on the Mount is he's not just trying to put across information. He's trying to put across good news, wonderful news for these people who feel like they're at the bottom. They feel like no one could care about them. And so as I end, I'd like to, rather than just go through and give you an interpretation of each verse, I'd like to read a bit of a reflective retelling of these verses. Just to be clear, this is not like a translation or anything like that. This is more just a reflection. And as I read this out, I just encourage you to allow these words to wash over you. And if you feel like you can really relate with them, if they feel like they're hitting home for you, then you are Makarios. There's wonderful news available for you. But even if they don't describe a situation you find yourself in, please know that there may be someone in your world for whom this is good news. This is wonderful news. So let me read this out, and I encourage you just to receive it. Wonderful news for those who are barely getting by, those who are unemployed or underemployed, those with little in hand and less in heart, and yet in the midst of it all, recognize their need for God. The kingdom of heaven is for these kinds of people. Wonderful news for those who are grieving the death of a loved one, those recovering from the breakdown of a relationship, those processing the doctor's diagnosis. In this kingdom, the Spirit, who is the Comforter, will be close to the brokenhearted. Wonderful news for those who'd been brought down low, the exploited ones, those taken advantage of, those who are forgotten about or go unnoticed, those who don't have their way heard or even considered. In this kingdom, the God who restores all things hears your voice. Wonderful news for those who have messed up relationships, those from broken homes, those recovering from divorce, those whose history is filled with friends they used to have. In this kingdom, wrongs are made right and broken relationships find healing. Wonderful news for those who choose to show mercy in all kinds of situations, even when it's inconvenient and illogical. Those who do not return violence with violence or hatred with hatred. Those who are quick to forgive and show God's heart of compassion. In this kingdom, mercy triumphs over judgment, and God is merciful to the merciful. Wonderful news for those who love God with all their heart, those whose outer action is an overflow of their inner world, those who've taken the time to scrub the muck in their heart and remove the log from their eye. In this kingdom, you will know God even as you are fully known by God. Wonderful news for those who seek to bring reconciliation to a world in conflict. Those who are not just peacekeepers, but are peacemakers, those who love their enemies and befriend their adversaries. In this kingdom, you will be considered children of God who are carrying on the family business of reconciling the world. Wonderful news for the Christians in a post-Christian world. Those who are paying the price to see heaven on earth. Those who've lost family and friends and loved ones for the sake of the gospel. Those who've counted the cost and have chosen the cross-shaped life. The kingdom of heaven is for these kinds of people. So once again, we're about to enter into a time of worship. And if this is wonderful news for you because it hits home with you, it describes where you're at the moment, Makarios, wonderful news. May this time of worship be a time for you to express your gratitude to God. But even if it's not, perhaps there's someone that you know of. Perhaps there's people in your world, friends or family members, who need to hear this wonderful news. May we lift them up as we worship God during this time. So I invite you to do that as we enter into a time of worship.